talked about it in letters, and we talked about it on the phone. But how you really feel about it, I don't really know.
What's your take on Cassavetes? 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 Misogynist, genius, misogynist, genius, misogynist, genius, misogynist, genius. What's your take on Cassavetes? What's your take?
Welcome to There's Sometimes a Buggy, Irresponsible Opinions About Classic Film. I'm Elise.
I'm Dave. This week, it's the Hollywood Studios Year by Year, the Fox Film Corporation, 1934. We'll be talking about a slice of Americana from John Ford, Judge Priest, and a slice of Bavariana in the form of Joe Mai's Music in the Air.
Judge Priest is actually more of a musical than Music in the Air.
It is very strange that Music in the Air only really has the one great musical number in it, repeated several times in several different ways. It's I've Told Every Little Star, the Jerome Kern standard. But yes, it does seem to be missing many other numbers from the stage
Like
show.
over a dozen, including one of the most important.
The Song Is You has come down through history as a more important standard than I've Told Every Little Star, but cut from the film, apparently.
So if this was Fox's idea of competing with Paramount by making an operetta, they went about it very wrong, and they suffered the consequences, which is that, according to Wikipedia, this was their worst performing film of the year.
I thought it was really good, but yes, it probably did not meet expectations of musical mavens.
The operetta had just been staged in 33, so people would have been expecting a little more.
And Kern, I don't think he ever became as popular with the masses as someone like Irving Berlin, but he was very well known and his music was quite beloved. There were quite a few adaptations already. We had The Cat and the Fiddle at MGM. There was Sweet Adeline at Warner Brothers. I think these were all the same year, right around 1934. And of course, Showboat is coming. Showboat had been done as a silent film, but Universal will be doing the quintessential Kern.
Did you know that Stephen Fetchit, who appears in Judge Priest, played Joe in the 1929 Showboat? Did you know
I did
that?
not know that, no.
Okay, neither did I. I found out I'm going to be doing a lot of Did You Knows, having done my standard 15 to 30 minutes of Wikipedia research prior to recording this.
I think we've got a lot to talk about here this week, and we're starting, of course, with Music in the Air.
I think we can dispense with Music in the Air pretty quickly, although I did enjoy watching it. I'm not sure how much I have to say about it. Of historical note is the fact that altogether here, reunited in Hollywood, Joe Mai, producer Eric Palmer, and in only his second Hollywood credit, Billie Wilder, as one of the screenwriters, credited with his name spelled I-E at the end.
Yeah, Billy Burke style.
He did not keep that.
These were all refugees from Ufa, which had been engulfed by Nazism at the time.
More like shipwrecks.
Needed to get out of there.
Many of them, like Joe Mai, was having a much better career in Germany than he had in Hollywood, so I'm sure he would have been very happy to stay there. He'd even started his own production company, which I think is how he knew Billie Wilder, being the man who brought Billie Wilder to Hollywood with these jobs at Fox. Now, Wilder has said that he always was aiming for Hollywood ultimately, although he would have liked to have done it under better circumstances. I'm not sure, since Billie Wilder's not speaking English yet, I'm not too sure what he contributed to this screenplay. Other than removing all of the songs, I'm not sure what was done to this screenplay, because the synopsis seems basically the same. I think that probably I can see Wilder's fingerprints on that ass grab that occurs when Douglas Montgomery grabs that secretary's ass. What actually occurs is more innocent than that on his part. But
it's very innocent.
On the part of the screenwriters, not so much. So, and I think...
It also gets Gloria Swanson's mind going.
I don't know if this was off mic or if this actually got into a podcast episode, but I remember us having a conversation, Dave, about ass touching and the code, and this comes right at the end of 1934, and there it is. They took all the songs out, but they left the ass grab in.
It's certainly no more risque than what they have going on in Bringing Up Baby in 1938.
That's true.
I think it must go in the tail.
Blatant ass touching is off the table. Faux innocent ass touching is in. Now, as to the actual playing of this, so Gloria Swanson's film career is
just about over
it's
here.
in the dumpster, and this film obviously did not help.
But this was almost certainly the origin of her connection with Billy Wilder, and so it has to be looked at as a piece of the prehistory of Sunset Boulevard.
Maybe, although he, again, is not speaking English yet, and could be just completely, this is his second job, he could be, like, completely hidden behind the scenes.
It's possible.
Or he could be on the set acting as a gag man, like, it's hard to say.
Well, that's what I think, right? And
talking in German to
the director.
To the director.
And the producer.
Who could actually speak to him. And Gloria Swanson is very funny in this, and she started out in comedies, but that is not what she became famous for as a silent actress. But it seems that as soon as she started working in sound films, she was doing comic parts, and she's really great. She's really funny.
I think that she was mostly known for sophisticated comedies in the silent era.
Well, I just looked at her filmography, and I ran the mouse over it, and almost all were being listed as dramas, so I don't know.
Well, all those early DeMille sex comedies that she made, those were what made her into a star.
Were they all comedies? You know, I'm thinking about Queen Kelly. That was definitely not intended as a comedy.
Part of her arsenal was always supposed to be comedy.
This is not sophisticated comedy.
No.
This was broad, and she was, again, very funny. It actually ended up reminding me, I don't know if the screenwriters could have taken any inspiration from this, but her relationship with John Bowles, who has never been so lively or interesting in a film before or since that I've seen, reminded me of 20th Century. There's some like proto-screwball stuff going on here. That, of course, was earlier in 34. It was also not a hit.
Obnoxious theater people behaving obnoxiously just didn't please the audiences of 1934. The cinema.
And flailing around and shouting and, doing very broad comedy.
Just having no redeeming qualities, really.
But 20th Century is, of course, extremely funny, and this was not bad.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Some nice performances as well by Douglas Montgomery and Al Sheen.
Douglas Montgomery, who just can't appear in a normal film. He's too intense.
He's one of my very favorite actors, and, we've covered quite a few of his movies already, but he's definitely the kind of person I would want to do an acteur oeuvre review on.
I wrote an essay that was more or less about Douglas Montgomery, because I wrote about two films in which he appeared, or close together, Waterloo Bridge and Little Man What Now. Two great films, so you can find that, listeners, on Bright Lights Film Journal.
And if you want a little bit better sense of what was really going on in Germany in 1934, you can look to Borzage films like Little Man What Now and...
Well, other than the
Mortal Storm.
Very confused and ambiguous politics of it.
Sure. The Mortal Storm, no longer ambiguous. Fascinating thing about this movie, right, is that it is set in a Bavaria that no longer exists.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
I mean, the Nazis were in full swing at this point, and Bavaria was one of the centers of power, right? Hitler's first attempt to take over the Reich was the beer hall putsch in Munich.
The non-speaking, trying desperately to keep his job and stay in America, Billy Wilder is not rocking any boats politically in this movie quite as yet.
Well, I just think it's kind of interesting. It almost feels subversive because obviously all three of them knew very well what they were doing. They weren't just innocently saying, oh, here's what Bavaria's like, kids. They damn well knew what it was like at this point, and they're showing something entirely different. It feels like some kind of 6-level chess critique of present-day Nazi Germany.
It fits very well with Fox, despite not having an American setting.
It's still rustic.
It's the plot of State Fair, except not sophisticated or subversive. It's the plot that State Fair changed. It's the plot from the source of State Fair, except that the characters don't even get seduced. They hardly even look at, the sophisticates that are trying to seduce them. They hardly even take them seriously in that way. They certainly don't sleep with them. All of the things we said in our State Fair episode about how envelope pushing this was, this idea that the rubes have these experiences with the sophisticates that are actually enriching to their lives, although one reacts against it and one moves toward it. all that's taken back in this movie.
To a large extent, yes. Although the music does get into the show, and it does come back and enrich the life of the village, that they all pitched in and got Al Sheen to Munich. They were able to get I've Told Every Little Star onto a big production. So that's something. In terms of their emotional lives, possibly, although it does enhance, I think, their feelings for each other. It feels like callow, ingenue, and juvenile at the beginning, and by the end, obviously, they have really been through something, and their profession of love at the end feels more earned.
Sure, all right.
But that is a more typical plot. Although what I really like is the speech given by the conductor at the end.
That seems to be...
That was amazing.
That seems to be probably taken directly from the libretto.
I believe it, but it's still amazing.
We love to serve ordinary people as long as they stay in the seats of the theater.
Keep off the stage, amateurs. Very much in keeping with the Fox ethos.
It's also explained, though, in that speech that Gloria Swanson she's someone who has come from the sticks or the streets herself, right?
Yeah.
So she's an artist. The classes here are not the elite or the privileged, the cultured, the literati, and the rubes. It's the artists and the ordinary people.
Gotta put in your time. But along the way, there's a lot of richly observed detail and some great performances by the people trapped in this rather staid plot.
Detail?
Life amongst the unruly theater folk.
Well, my favorite part, of course, was I'm not sure if I would call that richly observed detail. I don't know how based on reality any of this is, or needs to be, but my favorite part was certainly the performance of the operetta with wastebaskets and all of that on heads and such.
They're so into it.
The physicality of that whole section, the physical comedy. That did remind me of the fun of doing what basically amounts to amateur theater.
It does feel like a Hawks film in that way too, right? If you're willing to dedicate yourself as a professional to your métier, then the film will respect you in a way.
Even if you behave badly, yes.
Exactly. And certainly our two younger stars are not really interested. They're starstruck, but they don't really...
Well, they become the prey of these sophisticates.
The enactment of the play, it's great because it shows the dynamism. They just have so much excitement about this silly play that they're putting on, but that they've conceived together, basically.
Oh, and that's going to be very entertaining for the audience once they get up there with some big sets.
And all the while, though, they're not even looking at each other during their love scenes. They're looking out at the audience, right? Which is these young lovers that have come to Munich.
Now, whoever came up with this...
It's brilliant.
Whether it's Joe Mai, Billie Wilder, or Oscar Hammerstein, what is interesting is this theme of the indirectness of affect, which creates the whole plot. That the people don't play their love directly to each other. They play it through art. These two sophisticates decide to work out their relationship through the medium of these two other people.
And it's very much in keeping with
the song, with the one
the
song
indirect nature of the great song at the heart of it all.
That they kept, yeah. So.
I've Told Every Little Star, which is the song at the heart of the action. It gets everyone moving towards Munich, and the song itself is about confessing your love to an audience of inanimate objects in the stratosphere rather than to the object of your affection, the nominal object of your affection.
Which is how these two rubes from the country are regarded by the stars. Do you agree with me about John Bowles being unusually lively in this film?
Yeah, of course. He's almost always...
He's usually an inert object himself.
I've certainly come to respect John Bowles because he's played an important part in many great films.
But this shows he could have done something else.
Well, we've seen him do other types of things, right? He was a musical comedy star himself. We've seen him in King of Jazz doing a rousing number of the Song of the Dawn, so he got pretty energetic there too.
He's actually funny, though.
Yeah, he's funny, he's goofy, he's kind of a pervert.
Great.
So yeah, he's not just Stephen Dallas disapproving of everything.
Clearly the results of this film at the box office would not have encouraged him or people to keep casting him like this.
And Gloria Swanson, likewise, I guess she was pretty much done until 1950 at this point, right? Does she have any more movies after this in the 30s?
After 33, her career is basically not even covered in her Wikipedia entry until 1938. I don't know what happened in 1938.
So we looked it up. She actually made no more films after this in the 30s. She made one abortive comeback in 1941 in Father Takes a Wife with Adolphe Menjou, and then really cemented her everlasting fame with Sunset Boulevard.
Well, except among people who know anything about silent film.
Sure, but that wasn't many people by that point. Silent films were not easy to see until pretty recently. And still, they're not all that easy to see. We saw her in the Kevin Brownlow Hollywood documentary interviewed in the 70s. She still looked amazing there, and she's very funny in the interviews.
It's hard to believe she couldn't have made a few more films off the back of Sunset Boulevard. I mean, it looks like she did make like maybe one more, but anyway, I guess we're not here to discuss the career of Gloria Swanson since we don't know anything about it.
I think it's a nice touch. We were looking at the cast list from the stage production. Nice that Al Sheen was brought onto the screen. One of the great vaudevillian, Sheen and Gallagher. They were, I think, probably the two.
Who is he playing?
Well, he's the dad, the
Okay.
guy that writes the song.
Sure.
Based on the warbling of a songbird.
He doesn't get a lot to do, but he does get that scene with his daughter when he's coming up with the song.
I remember him best because he turns up in Ziegfeld Girl in 1941, kind of playing himself, although he's even older at that point, but he's playing himself in the 20s. He's still great.
But we better leave a lot of room to discuss Judge Priest.
So, Judge Priest by John Ford.
On the face of it, not knowing anything about the politics of this film, it's very enjoyable. I marvel at the world that Ford creates in these Will Rogers films, just so goddamn folksy and cozy, cut off from any sense of reality.
One that we haven't seen, which is Dr. Bull.
Steamboat Round the Bend was even better,
Yes.
but this was very enjoyable. Will Rogers is just so tremendously engaging and such an expert at this character he's created. And he works. This is the first time. I mean, I guess I've seen Stephen Fetchit, Lincoln Theodore, Monroe Andrew Perry. I've seen him in enough films now to get over the shock of the racism of the character, or that creates the circumstances of this character. Was actually really able to finally enjoy him as a performer in this film. Ford is giving him an unusual amount of space to perform, and he has real chemistry with Will Rogers. They do also appear together in Steamboat Round the Bend.
Yeah.
But this is kind of looser. This is a looser film that has like a lot of set pieces and, as I said, a lot of musical numbers sung by Hetty McDaniel and a chorus of other black female singers that Will Rogers sometimes joins in.
That's not a small thing, right? That's a huge political statement to have him singing songs with Hattie McDaniel. So.
He is, of course, Cherokee. Did you know that his father was a judge, prominent political figure?
In Oklahoma?
He was, in fact, born in Rogers County, named in honor of his father, Clem Van Rogers. How would you pronounce this? Oolagaw? Oklahoma.
Always been known as one of the most prominent people to come out of Oklahoma. We talked about another prominent Oklahoman, Jennifer Jones, although that was never dwelt upon in her case, but he really leaned into it.
I wish that I knew Ford's oeuvre better to understand his political trajectory. These early films for Will Rogers certainly have a conservative liberalism to them that is very appealing.
John Ford is very hard to place on the left-right political spectrum in some ways. By the 50s, even then, he doesn't really fall into line completely with any camp. He is a right-winger in terms of being an anti-communist, but he's more at war, actually, in day-to-day dealings with the Blacklist, famous fight with Cecil B. DeMille.
I'm not so much talking about his personal politics as the politics of his films, of his westerns, the political implications of them.
I guess there are many ways to look at them, right? They are about the West, or the South in this case. They are hearkening back to traditional Americana, but they never do it in quite the most straightforward way.
One thing you can say about this and Steamboat Round the Bend, which, I don't know, could this have been Rogers' influence? Who knows?
Well, Will Rogers was a subversive. He was not a conservative in any way.
But you say you hate his newspaper column.
It's awful, but it's just, he's getting paid a lot of money to write one paragraph a day just making fun of politicians. So
because these two
he's
films...
not putting his heart into that. He's putting his heart into these movies.
These two films are radically feminist. They are making those statements clear. That's not something... It's not like Ford is anti-feminist, but that's not something you particularly associate with Ford's westerns.
No.
And they're also both of them are class conscious. It amounts to the same thing in both movies. And yes, who knows if this singing with the black
No, that is a
performers,
huge deal.
if that is again Will Rogers' influence, who knows?
Yes, it has to be. He must have had to fight for that because no studio would have wanted to have that scene on because it probably got banned in some southern states. Or anyway, it ran the risk of being banned, even though it is on the surface the most celebrationist Confederate film you'll ever see.
Although subversively so.
Exactly.
But by 1938, Betty Davis singing with the slaves in Jezebel, this is not politically radical at all.
Right, but it's not the same thing because there she is clearly
commanding it.
Exactly. He's actually joining in. Now, they do occupy different social strata in the town, and that is not a secret.
Well, he's a judge.
Exactly. But the way he behaves in those scenes, it really is more in a comradely way. Slinks into the number.
Uses his blues voice.
Obviously, we're not trying to say, no one can say that this does not suffer mightily from being a product of a deeply white supremacist society. That is the first thing you have to say. But then, if you feel like going beyond that, and I understand why some people wouldn't want to, the nuances underneath that, or within that white supremacist structure, you can start to see some really interesting things.
Yeah, those things are certainly worth examining in popular culture of the past. However, the relationship, the sort of marriage between Will Rogers and Stephen Fetchit, who did you know that his family was from the West Indies, so he was not from a North American slave family, unlike this character he's playing. The relationship Will Rogers develops off the bat with Stephen Fetchit, that's the purpose of the first scenes to establish. Variations of that do appear in Ford films, like obviously the relationship in Man Who Shot Liberty Valance between John Wayne and Woody Strode. Although in the context of 1962, that ends up looking almost offensively conservative.
Well, it is offensively conservative. There's feeling between them, but they're not really having fun together like this.
Somehow, well, there's deep feeling between them.
Very deep feeling,
he,
obviously.
rescues him. Woody Strode rescues John Wayne at a crucial point, more than once, I think. So it's very much in the Leslie Fiedler American homoerotic marriage, romantic relationship between
on the raft,
white and black, which can take place
outside of
any
the
kind
city.
But also outside of any kind of. It's not inherently progressive.
No, definitely not.
It's just an archetype in the white imagination, in the white supremacist imagination. However, somehow Will Rogers plays it differently.
Oh, he definitely plays it differently. Again, there is a hierarchical relationship between them. He's a judge, prominent citizen in the town, even though an oddball, eccentric, prominent citizen. Stephen Fetchit is a character who's being accused of being a chicken thief, just going to be thrown in jail just on principle because that's how they handle things in this town. Later on, Will Rogers actually refers to this as a lynching or a prospective lynching, and that is a really strong statement. You were not really supposed to talk about these kinds of...
Probably only a star with the power of Will Rogers could get away with talking about lynching of black people as a problem.
And this is something that Congress was debating every day. Should the federal government pass laws that stop this horrifying practice from going on? And they never quite could do it because there were too many Southern politicians blocking it with filibusters all the time. But Will Rogers can do it. So there is that hierarchical relationship, but it does still feel more fun, at any rate, than the kind of devotion that you get in Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Interesting.
You know, they're getting each other's goat, or anyway, getting on each other's nerves in a fun way in this movie, which is...
yeah, it really does seem like a marriage. More than, as you say, like the romantic devotion that's more associated with Leslie Fiedler archetype or concept.
And again, I don't want to overstate things. He is still basically playing the role of a servant in Will Rogers' house. He's getting asked to do things. He's in his employ at this point to keep him from being lynched.
But something you can perhaps credit Ford with in this film is the choice to let these two vaudevillians, and Stephen Fetchit was a big star, let these two vaudevillians just play together so that you can actually really see the intricate rhythms of their comedic timing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And also a great scene with Hattie McDaniel, who is improperly credited. This is one of her first film credits, because she had just joined, apparently, the Screen Actors Guild.
Yeah, they put an S on her name in the credits.
And superfluous S. There's a great scene with her and Stephen Fetchit.
Yeah, I mean, she's immediately a megawatt star. You can see that in any other context, she would have been a lead player. We do know that she did go on to do about as well as you could do in a white supremacist Hollywood of the time.
Well, yeah, she was the first black actor to receive an Academy Award.
The debates raged at the time and since about how to think about her career.
Well, never mind how to think about Stephen Fetchit's career.
Well, exactly. That's why I wanted to focus on her first, right?
Well, we didn't, though, because he did more speaking in this film.
No, I just mean I know more about what Hattie McDaniel herself thought about all of this, right? She had a kind of stock answer. She said,
Better to play a maid than to be a maid. We've all heard it, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Now, I'm sure Stephen Fetchit had a similar response, and I would like to read a book on him, or he must have been interviewed.
I mean, the fact that he was from West Indies descent makes it even more complicated. That he created this vaudevillian character, obviously not freely out of an infinite number of choices. So before we get into the plot of the film, and hopefully you can tell us a little bit about the historical context, we should just mention the author of the stories that this film and its remake, also by John Ford,
The Sun Shines Bright,
were based on. Irvin Cobb. So he was, in addition to being an author, he was a columnist from Kentucky, and he covered World War I for the Saturday Evening Post, and he did highlight the fighting of black soldiers in that war, so that suggests I couldn't find anything else about his political orientation in this article.
It'd be interesting to know how he covered it. The army was segregated at that time.
It says here, highlighted the discipline and courage displayed by black American soldiers fighting in Europe during World War I.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds positive.
It suggests that the tolerance featured in these stories is about along the lines of what we see in the film.
It's a novel?
Stories.
Okay. About Judge Priest?
About Judge Priest.
So Judge Priest is an eccentric magistrate in small town Kentucky.
But very powerful, that his family has had a lot of power in the area for, I think, 25 years gets mentioned.
Well, more than that, I think. I think they have historic clout going back before the Civil War. So they're a well-respected family, and he hasn't really held up his end of the bargain. His sister-in-law is doing all of that these days in terms of maintaining their class position.
Almost like Harvey.
Exactly. He's Elwood P. Dowd.
Except he's got Stephen Fetchit instead of Giant Rabbit.
And he's also got a job, unlike Elwood, and he gets to make decisions about life and death for people in the town. He errs on the side of tolerance, as he says. Certainly is wise to some of the excesses and horrors of his own society. When he sees people ganging up on Stephen Fetchit, he just uses indirection. That trial just gets derailed by the judge, right? All of a sudden, he starts telling stories and getting everyone yammering on about the past, and we don't even see the conclusion of that. Just all of a sudden, Stephen Fetchit is no longer charged with thievery.
Well, he starts talking in his meandering way about going fishing, and then the next thing we know, it's segued to him and the judge going fishing together, and now they're just friends for life.
Yeah.
BFFs.
Exactly. This is the way he handles typical cases that come before him. He has a humanist approach. He wants to find out what's really going on, and he's certainly not interested in preconceived notions about anybody. He lives alone in a big house. His family is all dead. His wife and kids both died. They never say exactly what happened, but either an accident or some kind of terrible plague wiped them all out, leaving him by himself. He's never remarried.
An extraordinarily moving scene.
It is. It's so
Despite
incredible.
the fact that there's melodrama music playing in the background that's totally unnecessary, even that can't kill the power of Will Rogers in this scene. He's so amazing.
No surprise that he is the most popular actor in Hollywood, right up until the time of his death.
Well, yes, he was a fan of aviation, and that cost him his life the following year.
Yeah. His brother has also died. His sister-in-law, she is the person that is basically concerned with the priest name at this point.
So he likes his nephew a lot, but hasn't moved in with that family because he can't stand his sister-in-law.
Now, the nephew has just graduated from law school. He has gone off to an Eastern college, and he's now returned, and he's going to hang up his shingle.
His voice still hasn't broken quite yet, though.
Now, that actor, I love that actor. It's Tom Brown, best known to me as Gilbert Blythe in the Anne of Green Gables.
So he worked with Anne Shirley and Gilbert Blythe.
Yeah, he did. Will Rogers, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, because he works with the actress who played Anne Shirley, whose name became Anne Shirley in Steamboat Round the Bend. Next door to Will Rogers is Anita Louise, a favorite of ours around here. She's in Love Letters.
As the nicest rival to the heroine ever in movies.
And at Warner Brothers in the mid-30s, she got into quite a few big-time roles in prestige dramas. Here, though, she is playing the sweet ingenue character who has a murky backstory that is keeping the sister-in-law from wanting to have anything to do with her.
It's not much of a role for her. So in Steamboat Round the Bend, the highlights, the big performances are from Will Rogers and Anne Shirley. And in this movie, it's basically Will Rogers and Step and Fetch It with some musical numbers by Hattie McDaniel, who was, in fact, a recorded blues singer.
Of course, yeah. That's the big plot. And you think, okay, well, we're going to follow Will Rogers in his attempt to get these two young people together, right?
Yes.
That's the kind of thing that we see in quite a few of his movies. So he knows that that's the right thing. They've been in love since they were kids. Now she knows that it's never going to happen. The sister has made it plain. Class, society, and the opinion of the genteel folks in the town
is... It's not just class. She's illegitimate.
Well, exactly. She has no class. She has no place in society because she can't trace her lineage back to anywhere. The mother showed up and gave birth and died in the town, and nobody knew whether she was married or not. Certainly didn't know who the father was.
I don't think we ever get to learn who raised her, but we do later learn that her father has been somehow giving her money to get her education.
Yeah, we learn that the father, who becomes a character, David Landau, in a very moving role as well, actually. And David Landau usually played, well, he's a pretty rough customer in this movie too, but he often plays even harder edge characters. He's best known to me as the murderous dad in Street Scene. Although even there, he's got pathos to him, although he does some very brutal things on camera or almost on camera. Here it's kind of more in the background. But he has been giving money to the Reverend Henry B. Walthall, who is famous, would have been famous still at this time as the little colonel from The Birth of a Nation. We've actually seen him on this podcast because he appeared in Me and My Gal as the paralyzed grandfather or father.
I faintly remember that.
We talked about him at that point, that he was from Birth of a Nation.
Yes, okay, yes, I know what you're talking about.
So here, he's actually got a very moving role as well, because he goes up on the stand and becomes the character witness to end all character witnesses.
What's his role in Birth of a Nation, which I have never seen?
Well, he's the little colonel. He is the main guy.
So what, is this like some kind of subversion of his most famous role or something, would you say?
I think it may be both. I mean, it's gesturing back to that role for sure. He's a noble Southern gentleman who goes to war in Birth of a Nation as well, so I'm not sure if it's subverting that, except...
Well, I mean, using him for another purpose, that's what I'm talking about.
In this movie, he was a noble Southern gentleman who went to war.
Sure, but he is the one who is responsible for everything converges at the end to make it possible for this convict to become a hero, and that's the purpose for which the Southern propaganda is used cleverly by Judge Priest.
Exactly.
And this is where I don't know how to describe the tone or the symbolism of this ending, exactly what portions of subversion and conservatism are in it.
Well, it's inextricable, right? Like, if I was...
Especially the service to which the black characters are put.
We'll talk more about that, too. We'll talk about everything. I think this is going to go long, because...
Well, I'm going to let you talk, because you are the person who's going to have informed ideas about all of this, as a scholar of the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Yeah, not so much the Civil War, but the antebellum period was my specialty.
Oh, okay.
Not the South, but I certainly read a lot about it because I was concerned with anti-slavery movements and transcendentalism, and I had to learn a lot about the South as well to know what they were talking about. Yeah, the best way to describe this, I think, it feels almost like a Popular Front film that instead of using American symbolism is using Confederate symbolism. I've never seen anything like this in my life.
I think you're kind of describing the recipe that Will Rogers was attempting to concoct as his character.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's totally crazy. It's
and
not something...
And he's wearing like a Colonel Sanders outfit the whole time.
Absolutely do not recommend anything like this. Better to just kill the legend of the South. But at the time, it was very much alive. And sadly, it's far more alive than it should be right now. More alive than it has been in a long time, thanks to demented developments in the United States in the past 20, 30 years. I guess we've given enough of the plot. We need to talk more about Kentucky. Kentucky as kind of a laboratory for what's happened in the United States. If you're not a scholar of the 19th century in America, you could probably be forgiven for thinking that Kentucky was a Confederate state. Certainly if you just watched this movie, or maybe if you'd never seen this movie and you were just thinking about the way discourse goes these days, you know, Mitch McConnell is from Kentucky, all these things. Was it a Confederate state?
I guess you want me to say no.
No, it wasn't. Now, the Confederate states, the leadership of those states felt like it was so important to defend slavery that they were willing to embark upon a suicidal mission to fight with a much more technologically advanced society. They were going to lose. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of the romanticism has come in since then, right?
Gone with the Wind?
They were never going to win, but they felt like maybe they could hold out long enough, get people in the North to be tired enough of it to just give up, because if it ever went the full distance, it was going to wind up with the occupation of the South, which is what happened. Kentucky was a border state. Maryland, Delaware, they're called that because they were slave states. They did not secede. They stayed in the Union. The main reason for that is that slavery wasn't important enough to those states. All the states to the south of them...
Economically important.
Exactly. The states to the south of them, slaves were often 40 or 50% of the population. In Kentucky, it was more like 15 or 20%. And they made a calculated gamble. Again, this is the leadership of the states. They decided, well, we'll just stay in the Union. Maybe they'll let us keep our slaves if we just shut up and don't do anything. They had to relinquish them, but they were ready for that too, rather than have their whole state steamrolled. Which is not to say that they were enlightened on the subject of slavery or race. It was an economic decision. Now, what is true is that a lot of people in Kentucky, and all the people in this movie are exemplars of this. Young men from Kentucky, many of them thought it was very romantic and they felt the call to join the Confederate Army anyway.
Okay.
So that's what Will Rogers is talking about when he says that he ran off to join the army.
Do you think they felt culturally Southern?
Yeah, of course they did. Well, they were slave states, right?
Right.
And that's what the Civil War was about. Don't listen to anyone who tells you that it wasn't about slavery. It was. Will Rogers, his character, ran off to join the army to defend slavery. That's what he did. There's no getting around that. Did it to defend slavery in states that weren't even his own.
He says at one point, we went and did what we thought was right.
The way he words it is amazing, too, because you know what he's really saying, if you care to read between the lines, is that he's now saying that it was wrong.
Okay, you think that implication is there?
I think he's putting that in there now.
Right.
As the character speaking in the present. Well, it's set in 1890, but the movie is 1934. If you wanted to willfully ignore the fact that he's clearly saying that, no, they made a mistake, you could, but I think that's what it's there for. That's why he puts it exactly that way.
I guess you're saying it would play in the South, but with some censorship?
Well, you know what? I think it's so successful. It's so Verhoeven-ish that it probably got away with all of this.
This is what I'm saying. Who is the audience for this, and what is being communicated to that audience? Or do you want to leave that discussion to the end?
Yeah, let's leave that to the end. So these characters, the whole town is composed of people who ran off, joined the army, and the ones that survived came back to Kentucky afterwards and settled back down into their original ruts, and he was on track to be a judge, so he became a judge. Now, he's been in conflict with a state senator who wanted to be a senator in Washington, and we're told that Will Rogers used his influence to block this. So there's real enmity between these two people. And they were talking about the Democratic Party. And you turned to me and you were saying, well, does that mean the other guy's a Republican? And no one would know this except someone that's read a lot about the period. But even in the 30s, but certainly in 1890, there was no Republican Party in any state that had been a slave state.
Okay.
Republican Party was the party of Lincoln and was persona non grata in all the southern states. That's why the Democratic Party didn't even have to really campaign in southern states. They had all those electoral college votes, no matter what. They didn't run against anyone. There were no Republican Party candidates in most of those states.
You could be more liberal or not within the Democratic
Well,
Party.
that's what I'm saying. So it was a one-party system in all of those states. So all of the political wrangling went on within the Democratic Party.
Right.
It was about primaries, or the equivalent of primaries, right? So backroom deals and conventions and that kind of thing. Who was going to represent and run for the Democratic Party was the whole election.
Right, okay.
So these two were both Democrats, and Will Rogers was very much a Democrat. That comes through in his column in the New York Times.
His father, as a politician, was fighting for Cherokee Nation rights.
Yeah, now Oklahoma was not a Confederate state. It wasn't a state at all during the Civil War. That was called, at that time, quote-unquote, Indian Territory.
Yes.
That's where the Cherokee had been banished to, right? The Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Nation was originally, their land was in northwestern Georgia and northeastern Alabama and some of Tennessee. They had become one of the, again, quote-unquote, civilized tribes. There were 5 of them. Basically, they assimilated to Southern society. So yes, they still owned land and they kind of lived in villages and towns that were Cherokee or Creek, but...
And many people, like Will Rogers' family, were very mixed.
Yeah, exactly.
With whites, but it was a matter of national, ethnic identification, political identification, whatever you want to call it, all of those things.
They assimilated fully to Southern society to the extent that they did have prosperous businesses and class stratification and slavery in their towns and in their territory. And still, when gold was found in their territory in the 1820s and early 1830s, white settlers wanted to push them off the land.
Yeah, so it was very much a precarious and false assimilation.
There was division in the national government about
That's why it doesn't pay to assimilate.
No.
That's why no one wanted to assimilate in Canada, because they knew that they would assimilate and still will assimilate
and still get fucked
as second-class citizens.
When people wanted to move in there, most of the tribes just basically left because they knew they weren't going to win. The Cherokee were the only ones who sued the national government and took it all the way to the Supreme Court to maintain their rights to their traditional lands where they had built towns. All the arguments that had been used to displace native tribes in the past, that they weren't using land the way Europeans did, right? Like with very settled property arrangements and agriculture conducted on European lines, they were doing all of that. So there was no reason, based on the stated grounds, to displace them. And the Supreme Court agreed with them. They said, yes, this is true. These are American citizens who have the same property rights as anybody else. So the Supreme Court at that time was run by John Marshall, who was a Federalist judge who had been appointed in 1801. The Federalist Party didn't exist anymore. It had been destroyed long ago. It was a vestige of a very much earlier time. Andrew Jackson was president at this time, who had basically built his entire career on superseding and bringing America into a new era of the common man, which had some good aspects to it, but a lot of it was about just whipping up rednecks. And this was a big part of his cultural and political base. These were the people that wanted to move into that territory. And he famously stated that Justice Marshall has made his decision. Let us now see him enforce it. Was not going to actually use any federal force to defend the Supreme Court decision. This is one of the most appalling travesties of civility and the rule of law in American history. So even if you're some kind of fetishist for American institutionalism, people would have been going crazy on Twitter over this at the time. He didn't do anything, and people were pushed off the land. The Trail of Tears was the most appalling result. It was a death march that was a Holocaust. I mean, it was cultural and real genocide.
I've heard of it, of course, but when did it occur?
It actually occurred the year after Jackson left the presidency, but it was all put in motion by him, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, was his vice president, totally agreed with everything that he did, so he just let it go on. The entire nation, everyone that hadn't left early, some people had left early and fared a little better.
But
still, they had to go to Oklahoma.
In any case, you said Oklahoma, yes, it was Indian territory, so
Yeah.
what did that mean exactly?
Well, it was a forced march across the continent to go settle this territory out in the West. Huge numbers of people just didn't make it. They died on the way, and it was called the Trail of Tears.
Right.
Now, obviously, a lot of them did make it there, and Will Rogers is descended from those people that did. Anyway, he knew something about racial injustice in America.
So, this all interests me a lot because clearly Will Rogers rose to a position, although it's not like this was common. There's not like a whole bunch of Will Rogerses in American entertainment, but rose to a position that couldn't have been occupied by a black performer.
The nature of American racism, it was baleful and harmful to everybody, but in different ways. And certainly anti-black racism was the most virulent and the most universally applied. There was no way to get around it in most cases.
But, as you say, this could have given him some
insight.
Well, clearly did give him some political insight, and just basically some, let's call it, given him some politics. I'd like to do more reading about Will Rogers.
I don't know a huge amount about him, and I'm sure that he had plenty of blind spots. I'm not saying I would agree with all of his politics, but you can see that he's got a certain insight that most people of his time that we get access to in popular culture did not have.
But as his character says, I know when to say ain't, and I know when to kiss babies. So this is, as you say, all being communicated in a way that is presented so that he can be this huge mass pop culture figure that he was.
Again, when you get into auteurship, obviously that usually is applied to the director. I do feel like this, you can sense the John Ford-ness of this film,
For
but
sure.
I feel that it's more of a Will Rogers film. And John Ford films are not this deftly satirical, generally. I guess that's an argument for people who are much more versed in Ford than I am and you are.
We're adding more Ford in, and it's going to be interesting to come at it from this perspective and to see how much we think, in retrospect, how much Ford was in these films.
Now, Ford's cinematography and his eye for tableau is in full evidence here. It's a beautifully shot
and just
movie.
the fluidity and the lyricism, and like I said, like a creation of a world, of a mood.
And the doorway shot.
The doorway shot of Will Rogers, Judge Priest.
Exiting the courtroom.
Very searchers.
Ford's fingerprints are all over this visually, but I do think that some of the tone is something that it's just not in Ford's usual arsenal. This is more a Will Rogers creation, I think, in terms of its tone. That's all the background there about Kentucky. You don't see anyone in here who supported the Union during the Civil War, but the whole state, as a state, did support the Union. So that's a really fascinating thing, and it's something that people remark upon all the time these days. Why are people flying Confederate flags in Minnesota and all kinds of states that had nothing to do with the Civil War? What the fuck is going on with the Confederate symbolism anywhere? Of course, it should be stamped out everywhere, but why is anyone attracted to this that doesn't even live in those states that were involved in this War of the Rebellion or war between the states? You get all these different aliases that people are using for the Civil War in this film. The war between the states is the one that has the most dignity to it, right? It sounds like this was just exactly what people wanted you to think at the time. Cutting-edge university scholars at the time, the idea was that the Civil War was this tragic thing that happened between these two great nations that didn't really need to have this bloody conflict. They could have resolved it in some better way if radicals on the left and right hadn't pushed them into it.
Okay, if you're saying slavery was an economic issue for the South, that explains why they fought for it. Why did the North fight. They were honestly just fighting to end slavery. It was actually an idealistic war.
No.
No, of course not.
No, there are no good guys in wars. There are plenty of bad guys, but there are no good guys. Lincoln was elected on a platform not of ending slavery, but simply of never allowing slavery to expand.
Right.
So he had no intention of touching slavery in the states that already had it. The conflict at that time was over whether there would be new slave states.
Yes.
The revisionist argument in American historiography, the idea that this was needless conflict, in some ways they had a point, because if the southern states had not freaked out and seceded, they probably could have kept slavery up until apartheid ended. That sounds crazy to say, but on the other hand, I don't really see how slavery would have been stamped out without a war. Maybe the kind of economic pressure that was put on South Africa by the 1980s would have stopped it. But at the time, they believed, the people making decisions in the South did somehow believe that Lincoln would be influenced by fringe Bernie Sanders types in the Republican Party, and he would eventually use the federal government to move against slavery in the states. And I think all of the evidence indicates that that's not true.
So the South was just paranoid. It was like how everyone thinks Justin Trudeau's socialist?
It was exactly like that. But see, these people really believed it. The people making decisions in the South were so paranoid that they actually believed it.
Well, I mean, fringe right-wingers in Canada actually believe
But these are not fringe right-wingers. These are the people actually controlling the levers of power.
Well, if your economic system was based on slavery, you probably would get that paranoid.
Again, this is a case of things getting out of hand, right? Slavery was absolutely the basis of the Southern economy, and it was the reason for the Civil War. However, most people in the South, not even close to most people, owned slaves. So most people had no stake in this. Again, it's always just the 1% or something similar to it that drives politics, very sadly. And at that time, yes, they had to use that kind of paranoia and the kind of inflated racial rhetoric in order to keep all the people that weren't really benefiting from slave economics on side and keep them ready to go to war over something that they weren't getting anything out of except for this...
White privilege?
Exactly. That's all they were getting. White privilege.
White privilege in the technical sense.
Well, citizenship, which was denied. The ability to vote was certainly denied to non-whites. But what good was it if all you could do was kowtow to the slaveholders' interests? But it worked.
Told me why the North went to war yet, which is what I asked.
When the South seceded, at that point, they felt they had to keep the Union together. That was the rationale, that these were traitors. A matter of national pride to keep the United States together. These were illegal secessions. They didn't take place under any kind of constitutional...
How did ending slavery become part of the war, then, if it wasn't part of the cause?
Well, it became expedient once states were being invaded. And, of course, the North was on the defensive for a lot of the war, because as much as they had much better technological infrastructure, all of the people in the army, all of the trained officers in the United States were Southern. So they had much better generalship in the South, but they just eventually were going to start losing.
Expedient how?
If you, let's say, take over Louisiana, as they did fairly early, they got down there, but they couldn't get into, the heart of the South. What's the best way to make sure that that state is pacified? Well, free all the slaves.
I've never heard any of this before.
There were people working with Lincoln. Charles Sumner was someone who comes out of, the 1960s. Somehow he exists in the 1850s and 1860s. He wants to integrate all schools, all kinds of things that go well beyond just ending slavery. And he is always pushing for, and you can put it in pragmatic terms as well. If you offer freedom to everyone in the South who is enslaved, well, they're going to start undermining. If the South can't send all their troops to the front lines because they're worried about all of their slaves taking over at home, that's a really bad situation for the South, and it just got worse and worse for them.
So let's start applying this to the film and to the satire tone that you're talking about.
All of this insane Confederate patriotism which is just part of daily life in Kentucky in the 1890s and in the 1930s. It's part of what was keeping the solid South together. You know, when Warner Brothers looks at this, you get They Won't Forget, which is one of the most scathing anti-Southern films you're ever going to see. But again, it presents the same portrait of the South in the 1930s as this place that is still living in the shadow of this defeat and this desire for revenge against the country that they also are supposed to love patriotically. Like this Confederacy thing, so insane, it's impossible to describe to anyone that hasn't read much about it. How can you be waving the American flag and a Confederate flag at the same time, the way all these ridiculous country and western, God bless the United States of America fuckers are doing all the time? It makes no sense, but they do it, and they seem to get some kind of satisfaction from it.
To me, what you're saying makes it seem as though the ending is, because I wasn't sure how to read it, is purely subversive.
I think so, yeah. Now, someone else might watch it and say, well, it's still not worth it. They're waving Confederate flags around. It's fucking insane.
All of this crazed Confederate patriotism is stirred up by Will Rogers' character with the help of Stepin Fetchit in order to have a man who was convicted for murder, and who did kill someone, he admits that much, and illegitimately fathered this daughter, to have him not only freed but made into a town hero. That seems like Miracle of Morgan's
I was about
Creek
to say that, yeah.
levels of satire and subversion.
It exactly is, right? Because what legitimates Anita Louise and makes her into a viable marriage partner now, it's this insane patriotism. It doesn't change any facts. So instead of sextuplets, it's just Confederate heroism that fixes everything.
Except this film having deeper tentacles, its tentacles deeper into very important American political history is even perhaps more subversive than Miracle of Morgan's Creek.
Yeah, and again, it's aware of this at all times. You might think, okay, well, this is all unconscious.
No.
When he has Stepin Fetchit sit outside the courthouse and play on his harmonica,
and
Dixie.
The lynching comment comes up when he mentions this idea.
Right, because what does Stepin Fetchit say? He'll say, okay, well, for that fur coat, all right, I'll play Dixie. I'll play anything. I'll play Marching to Georgia. Now, did you look up what Marching to Georgia is? One of the big Union battle songs, right? It's about Sherman razing Georgia to the ground as they drove Dixie down.
From the context, I could imagine
freedmen would have been happy to play, right? Because it was about their liberation.
I'm so excited to have your skunk coat that I would play the happiest song I know.
Exactly. And Will Rogers is like, whoa, wait a minute. And again, Will Rogers is not offended by this. He thinks it's cool that Stepin Fetchit comes up with this idea, but he's like, don't do it, because I don't think I can stop them from killing you if you do that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's an amazing moment.
Yeah, if you don't know that history, you don't realize how radical all of that stuff is.
But you can, like, the scent comes off of it.
Sure.
Regardless.
But I think even more importantly, nobody watching the movie in 1934 would have been unaware of what that stuff meant.
Yes.
But somehow it got through.
Because of his stardom, I have to imagine.
Yeah, and I think because of the surface level pro-Confederate sentiments that are there.
Yeah, but you'd have to be a complete idiot to not see what is going on.
Censors are complete idiots.
But is the audience? This brings me back to the question of who is this made for? That's always the question with satire. The question is, especially when it's so subversive, if it's so subversive that the people who would be best served by this satire don't even notice it.
Yeah.
Is it really just for the enjoyment of the people who are able to read the levels of it?
When Starship Troopers came out and everyone thought it was just a straight up fascist film, what good does that do?
Exactly.
I mean, in retrospect, and of course, it's only been a little bit more than 20 years, so I guess...
Is it just for the pleasure of the people who get it, to watch it and go, you fucking idiots who love this movie and are taking it on surface value? I mean, I wouldn't deny anyone, including myself, that pleasure, but...
Again, if I'm right in thinking of it as a weird transposition of the Popular Front idea of making...
expand on that.
The Popular Front was the chief strategy in America during the 1930s used by leftists of all stripes, socialists and communists, in order to exert some influence upon the drift of the New Deal and upon American politics in general. The idea was that you stopped taking an adversarial relationship towards American tradition and make an argument that all of American history was trending toward something like the New Deal and then well beyond the New Deal to actual socialism. And you get it in a lot of American popular culture. Things like The Devil and Daniel Webster spring to mind, right? Where it's a story by Stephen Vincent Benet, and then it becomes a film by William Dieterle, which we're actually going to cover in RKO 1941. But that film is all about a farmer's grange, so an agrarian union, and the way that they are trying to band together to resist the efforts of capital to destroy them. It's very clearly yoking all kinds of these very rock-ribbed American agrarian traditions to something like a 20th century vision of socialism.
So I'm just poking around here into Will Rogers' family a little more. So his father was a state senator, not a federal senator. Apparently his father became associated with the Cherokee leader William Penn Adair, who entered the Confederate States Army on the promise that the Confederacy would support an Indian state if it won the war, which is presumably the basis also on which his father became part of the Confederate Army. So he would have had this whole Confederate history in his own family, but at the same time it was very much real politics.
Yeah, so a very complicated relationship with the stars and bars for Will Rogers there. Yes, at the time, throughout the 19th century, into the beginning of the 20th century, Oklahoma was not a state, it was Indian territory. And from what you're reading there, and I think that that's true, I believe I've read that before, that there was this kind of an arrangement with the Confederacy to fast-track Indian territory to statehood. And once you become a state, you acquire a lot more pull within the nation, right? Because you can actually send senators and congressmen to Washington. When you're just a territory, you're governed like occupied territory.
Which is what happened with his own father.
You know, you can make some local decisions, but you can't affect the nation as a whole unless you're a state. It's what's going on with Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico right now. They have no representation within the federal government, direct representation.
So that doesn't in any way, if anything, that supports the idea that Rogers is taking a very ironic view of this Confederate mania.
Where he grew up, it wasn't a Confederate state, but there were reasons to feel some affinities with this Confederacy, taking up arms against the United States, which people in Kentucky and in Indian Territory had no great reason to love either. And the federal government kept Indian Territory as Indian Territory until 1907 or thereabouts. So no real favors were done by the heirs of Lincoln, right, to Will Rogers' state. But yeah, it's a very complicated thing, and I would understand if someone just doesn't want to deal with any of this. It's really fucked up and insane. It comes out of
I thought it was amazing. American politics, all nation politics, are fucked up and insane, and it's nice to see a movie that has some of that woven into it.
I can't speak for all people. I can come to this with a kind of ironic detachment.
I expect you to.
But if you're coming from a totally different subject position, I could see where you might not even want to subject yourself to this.
On another topic, sort of not, what did you make of the scene where Will Rogers is doing Stepin Fetchit's voice?
It's crazy. It's totally crazy. It's happening off screen at first, and you think that they're doing it together.
Yeah, that is, I mean, for me...
It's a deconstruction.
Yes, the way I read it, or you can read it as Will Rogers showing that anybody can do that voice.
Exactly.
That it's just a fucking made-up, ridiculous, stupid character.
Yeah, I do think that it's a defamiliarization. Yeah, it is showing us that, no, the person who goes by the name of Stepin Fetchit in the credits and plays this character is not anything like this for real. This is a comedy character, and Will Rogers can do it too. Not anyone can do it, because you have to be probably quite a gifted comedian in some way to do it.
Yeah.
But you don't have to be of any race to do this. Anyone can be...
Which is making the point I was trying to make earlier a lot more effectively.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I'm glad that you brought that up. I had been thinking it at the time, but I totally forgot about it in my rush to talk about Kentucky and the Civil War historiography. So I guess that's it for now, but I will be reporting back, I have no doubt.
You've made me like this movie even more than when I was just enjoying watching it. Yeah, but there's just so much to think about here and learn about, and I don't know how Will Rogers has been written about.
I'm gonna perform some research.
We can, if we can find some good sources, we will just do a Will Rogers special subject sometime.
Well, that, of course, could be great, but in the meantime, I'll probably come back with a special segment in a few weeks where I report on my findings in Southern papers and just...
Because you love looking through those old newspapers.
I've got my newspapers.com subscription now. I'm going to look through...
What if there's nothing?
Then I'll report that there's nothing.
Because, of course, we know that, speaking of Miracle of Morgan's Creek, that went over great. It was extremely popular. If people understood that this was a complete deconstruction of illegitimacy, the concept of illegitimacy, the concept of marriage, and small-town Midwestern life, nobody cared. They just thought Eddie Bracken was funny.
So we'll see. If the newspapers show no sign that they are aware of a subversion of the kinds of values we typically associate with the Confederacy.
But then it just becomes a great piece of American art with all of these geological layers that can be dug through by future generations.
This is a cultural archaeologist's dream. So we'll end this week with a letter from our friend Adam. This is in reaction to our Phantom Thread
I didn't read it because I like it when you read it to me, so.
So here we go. He says, I had a nervous excitement when I saw Phantom Thread on the schedule, and we encourage all of you to follow Adam's example and look at our schedule. It now extends to 2023. I had seen the movies in theaters. It was my first Anderson film, and it instantly made me a fan. Having that be my first and deepest impression of his films, it makes me a unique PTA fan. The extreme maleness of There Will Be Blood felt completely different from what had drawn me to his films. I've only seen Magnolia once, but I share Elise's dislike of it, and I share Dave's love of Punch Drunk Love.
Awesome. Best of both worlds here.
All this to say, sometimes a film can mean so much to you on your first watch that there's a hesitance to rewatch it. When Phantom Thread came out, I was in my 6th year of a relationship, and the past year had been spent trying to figure out together if this was going to be an even longer thing. The film spoke to that experience in such a direct way. Elise brought up Howard Hawks, and I've seen some discussion on Twitter of the film as an anti-Hawks film.
Did I bring up Howard Hawks in that episode? On what do you remember, Dave?
I think just the devotion to his métier.
Maybe, okay.
I think it is specifically an anti-Angels Have Wings film. Jean Arthur has to submit to the male's profession and lifestyle to be with him. In Phantom Thread, the reverse is true. Daniel Day-Lewis is taught that the only way to have a real relationship is to allow someone to come in and reshape what you thought you knew and wanted.
Hey, that's a reading that's right up our alley. We like that.
More than that, it's a continuous process. I'm happy to report that my relationship is now in year 9, and we plan on many years to come.
Oh, you're ahead of us.
Yes, you always will be, as long as we all keep going, which I hope we do.
Now it's a competition.
No, keep going. We'll try to keep going.
It's a good competition, then we all try to keep going.
Oh, yes, okay. But we never want to overtake you.
No.
So he says, thanks for the opportunity to revisit the film with a more critical eye. So an Anti-Angels Have Wings film. I like that.
Yeah, we like that. That's great.
It's one of my least favorite Hawks films, although one day we'll have to revisit it. Well, we will be, because we're doing Jean Arthur.
Well, it's really more... Okay, but you can also, to defend Howard Hawks, you could look at it as a version of Bringing Up Baby.
Sure.
Because that's a film about how Cary Grant has to learn that there's more to life than work by a woman who regularly infuses chaos into his life.
The only thing that Katharine Hepburn doesn't do to Cary Grant in that movie is poison him.
And, I mean...
She would have done it if she had thought of it.
Or not thought of it.
No, that's great.
She does burn his socks, though.
Oh, she does all
It
kinds
has
of things.
practically... Well, she destroys his dinosaur. That's the main thing.
Yeah, that's a poisoning all of its
All
own.
of its own. It's possibly worse. That would be like if what Alma did was set fire to the house.
Analogy.
Actually, the destruction of the wedding gown, which
Exactly.
she does accidentally orchestrate.
Yeah, she makes him do it by poisoning him so that he falls on it.
So it's not so much an anti-Hawks film as it is like the good Hawks versus the not as good Hawks.
Yes, it's Hawks versus Hawks.
Oh, that was great. Gothic romance as screwball comedy. So what's happening next week, Dave?
Next week, Elise, we begin the Acteurist Oeuvre Review Season 3. We'll be talking about Clara Bow.
Oh, I'm so excited.
So we're going to start right out with Down to the Sea in Ships, 1922, and Black Oxen, 1923. So if you have any trouble finding these, as always, please get in touch with us. We can help you find them.
Yep, do it.
Silent films on the podcast for the next 6 months at least.
Yeah, we managed to fit that in finally. Our silent film education is missing a lot.
I've seen It and The Wild Party. That's it.
Yeah, well, I've seen the same ones you have.
So all the other Clara Bow films are going to be totally new to both of us, and hopefully you out there will share our journey. Talk to you soon.